Episode 178, Not with a Bang, but a Whimper. Last time, we left off with Anthemius holed up in Rome, and Ricimer making all kinds of noises about ousting the Eastern appointed emperor and replacing him with someone more pliable. When Olybrius and his little diplomatic mission showed up from Constantinople in the spring of 472, those noises turned into direct action. Hidden among the papers of one of the secretaries was a message from Leo to Anthemius directing his Western colleague to kill Ricimer and Olybrius in order to eliminate these two most obvious threats to Anthemius' rule. When Ricimer's men discovered the message, they showed it to their boss, who showed it to Olybrius. Both were outraged and agreed that they should join forces and kill Anthemius before he could kill them. Their agreement was sealed right then and there when Ricimer ordered his men to hail Olybrius as the new Augustus of the West. Now, this is never mentioned in the sources, but I can't help but wonder about the credibility of Ricimer in all this. I mean, think about it. Ricimer's men just so happen to find a written note from Leo that leaves Olybrius with no choice but to side with the virtual king of Italy instead of carrying out his original mission of brokering a peace. I mean, it might very well be true that Leo sent along handwritten, murderous orders, but it's not like it's implausible that Ricimer just made the whole thing up, you know? Word quickly reached Rome that a coup had begun down the road, and Anthemius rushed out of hiding to direct the gates of the city be shut and the defenses manned. He then sent messengers up the imperial post roads to Gaul to summon all the available forces there left under imperial command. But by the time the messengers arrived, whatever forces were left in Gaul had already begun to fracture. The available soldiers split between a magister militum, a general named Bilimer, and a Burgundian chief named Gundobad, who just so happened to be Ricimer's nephew. Gundobad had at one point served as magister militum for Gaul, but at some point he had been replaced by Bilimer, either following the near civil war of the previous year, or right at this very moment. By which I mean that, knowing he couldn't trust Gundobad, Anthemius sent his plea for help to Bilimer, officially making him magister militum in the same breath. Whichever way it went down, when the coup erupted, two forces wound up marching down from Gaul to help, one led by Bilimer to reinforce Anthemius, Ricimer, and Olybrius. It is hard to see this ever really working out for Anthemius. He was, after all, a stranger in a strange land, and most of the local nobility was solidly in Ricimer's camp. But the emperor did somehow manage to keep Rome shut tight, at least into the early summer. It seems pretty clear, though, that he was pinning all his hopes on reinforcements from Gaul, and morale within Rome was almost entirely based on the assumption that relief was on its way. When that relief showed up in July, though, the air really went out of Anthemius' sails. Bilimer arrived with his troops from Gaul all right, but he was promptly defeated in battle by Ricimer's forces. This brief battle is interesting to us for two reasons. First, it pretty much ended any hope Anthemius had of escaping this thing with his life, and second, it marks the first appearance in the historical record of Odoacer, who was a commander of some high-level bodyguards who had gone over to Ricimer back in the spring. With Bilimer defeated, the entire citizen body of Rome essentially deserted Anthemius, as there was absolutely no reason for any one of them to suffer or die on his behalf. He was simply not a ship worth going down with. So as the gates of Rome were opened and Ricimer's men came pouring in, once again Anthemius took refuge within a church. There is some disagreement as to whether he went back to St. Peter's, or whether he holed up in Santa Maria of Trastevere, but it doesn't make much difference, because it didn't do him any good. He was tracked down by a search party led by Gundobad, and when the fallen emperor was found, Gundobad paid very little attention to the sanctity of the church. Anthemius was immediately beheaded. He was about 50 years old and had been emperor for just over 5 years. There are now 4 emperors left. Anthemius was the last who had any sort of talent or ability. With Anthemius dead and Olybrius now elevated in his place, the Italian nobility, who were already mostly with Ricimer, were now doubly happy because Olybrius, one of their own, was back in power. But the man who had to have been happiest of all was the Vandal king Genseric. He had been fighting and arguing and pleading and cajoling to get Olybrius on the throne for years, going all the way back to the fall of Avitus and Ricimer's initial rise to power back in 458. Now he finally had what he wanted. The brother-in-law of his daughter-in-law now sat on the throne of the West. These were happy days for the Vandal king. Just a few years after it looked like he was going to be toppled from power by a massive invasion fleet, not only was he still standing, but he had finally gotten his way. Happy, happy days. But fate, oh fate, she has a wicked sense of humor. First she giveth, and then she taketh away. But at first, she appeared to be truly in the giving sort of mood, at least from Genseric's point of view. Because in August of 472, just a month after Anthemius' fall, Ricimer, the virtual king of Italy, keeled over dead. The historical diagnosis is massive hemorrhage. He was about 67 years old and had been the virtual king of Italy for 15 years, bridging the gap between Stilicho and Odoacer. So from Genseric's point of view, this all could not be working out better. The only thing that would have stopped him from exerting a huge amount of influence over Olybrius was Ricimer, and now Ricimer was dead. The only thing that could possibly screw this up is if Olybrius were to, suddenly keel over dead himself. And what are the odds of that happening? What's that you say? Oh, come on, you've got to be kidding me. In late October or early November 472, Olybrius died of dropsy. Though no one seems to want to give me a solid birth date, he was maybe in his mid-40s when he died, and had been emperor for 6 months or 3 months, depending on whether you date his reign from his elevation by Ricimer or from the fall of Anthemius. Just like that, there are only 3 emperors left. Well, 2 if you happen to be a partisan of Julius Nepos, but mainstream history does not appear to be a partisan of Julius Nepos. When Ricimer died, he was immediately succeeded by his nephew Gundobad, who, after killing Anthemius in a church, had proven himself to be a man you did not want to mess around with. So when Olybrius died a few months later, the power that had normally been reverting to Ricimer instead reverted to Gundobad. The new virtual king of Italy pondered what he was going to do about the vacant throne over the winter of 472-473, and then in March, decided to elevate the unknown to us anyway, captain of the elite court bodyguard, Glycerius, about whom we know next to nothing before he becomes emperor in March of 473. Glycerius' elevation, like I should note the elevation of Olybrius the year before, was never recognized in the East. For Leo, Anthemius had been the legitimate emperor of the West, and everything that had happened since his death amounted to illegal usurpation. Had Olybrius lived, Leo would have certainly tried to toss him out and replace him with another Eastern candidate. But Olybrius died before Leo could even begin to plan a counter-revolution, so it was left to Glycerius to deal with the wrath of Constantinople. Well, not exactly the wrath of Constantinople. Though the East had recovered somewhat from its debacle in North Africa, I doubt Leo had any interest in sending another army off to the West. For example, it probably would have been political suicide. So instead, he got in touch with the aforementioned Julius Nepos, and talked him into mounting an expedition to oust the usurpers in Italy. Nepos was the nephew of the general Marcellinus, and he had inherited his uncle's quasi-independent territory of Dalmatia, and as such had access to a good number of Hun and Goth mercenaries. Leo essentially told Nepos that Constantinople was prepared to recognize and go seize the throne from Glycerius. This sounded like a pretty good deal to Nepos, so he started to prepare for an invasion. But Julius Nepos' invasion was not the only invasion Glycerius and Gundobad had to contend with. Up in Gaul, the Goth king Euric was getting even more ambitious, and it appears that he had designs on perhaps sweeping down and seizing northern Italy for himself. At the same time, another Goth king named Vitimer, who ran a little autonomous kingdom between the Danube and Dalmatia, also appears to have been considering making a run at Italy. Which brings me to a point that I probably should have made a long time ago, but I didn't for decent reasons that eventually became a little ridiculous. Back during the initial run-up to the Battle of Adrianople, we distinguished between the Tervingi and Greuthungi branches of the Goth nation. But ever since then, it's just sort of been Goth this and Goth that. This is mostly because, for the last century, we've been dealing exclusively with Alaric's Goths, the Tervingi, whose descendants are now firmly established in Gaul, so there was no need to make any distinction. But what about that most famous of Goth distinctions? If you listen to the history of Rome, you would never know that there was something called a Visigoth and something called an Ostrogoth. So, what is an Ostrogoth and what is a Visigoth? Well, at first, I avoided the terminology because it was not invented until way later, and is often anachronistically misapplied to the groups that we've been dealing with, and I didn't want to get caught in the trap. But by this point, the late 400s, even if the labels weren't contemporaneously used, everyone agrees that we call these guys Visigoths and those guys Ostrogoths. So who were they? Well, essentially, all Visigoth means is Western Goth, and all Ostrogoth means is Eastern Goth. So Alaric's Goths, who had moved into Italy and then up into Gaul, became known as the Visigoths. The Goths who stayed behind, straddling the Danube and contending with the Huns, became known as the Ostrogoths. So, for example, history books often speak of the Visigoth sack of Rome in 410, and the Ostrogoth kingdom that was established in Italy following the fall of the Western Empire. In terms of reality, these signifiers mean very little. But in terms of understanding history and keeping things straight in your head, Visigoth and Ostrogoth is actually a fairly important distinction. So, now you know. What that means is that up in Gaul, the Visigoth king Euric was likely planning an invasion of Italy, and over south of the Danube, his counterpart, the Ostrogoth king Vitimer, was contemplating the same thing. The great fear down in Ravenna, where Glycerius had taken up residence, was that the two great branches of the Goth nation would join forces and crush what was left of the empire. Possibly to Glycerius' great credit, though, or maybe it was just luck, not only did the two Goth branches not link up, but neither wound up invading Italy. This may have been the work of Gundobad, though, who, right around this same time, returned to Gaul to attend to some family business. It is not unreasonable to assume that the ethnic Burgundian used his contacts within the neighboring Visigoth community to secure a peace. But neither Gundobad nor Glycerius was able to do anything about Julius Nepos, who was not going to be deterred by anything unless his patron Leo died and threw Constantinople's backing of the adventure into doubt. But that's not going to happen. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. In January of 474, Leo the Thracian died. He was 74 years old and had been Emperor of the East for 17 years. When he died,